Part 2, an occupational health case study on asbestos regulation. In part 1 of this lecture, I introduced the concept of environmental health, arguing that it has a broader perspective than that of biomedicine or public health, and introducing concepts of environmental justice, lay knowledge, politics, and economics. In part 2 of this lecture, I am going to focus on occupational health as a subsection of environmental health and provide you with one case study which demonstrates some of these broader concepts. Ulrich Beck, in his book Risk Society in 1992, wrote about how the conditions of modernity relating to industry and technology created an embedded risk. We know now that technology and urban industrial activity has had a massive influence on the environment and on health. The scale of occupational health is huge and rising. In 2006, Rantanen recorded figures of 270 million workers experiencing occupational health accidents, 360,000 employees dying, and 160 million workers contracting occupational diseases around the world. And these are the recorded incidences. So they're just the tip of the iceberg. Far more unrecorded incidences take place. In addition, as forms of global production change, we see a deterioration in workers' health and safety. This includes economic shifts, business re-engineering, new technologies, and changes in the way the workplace is conceptualized. In developing countries, basic occupational health standards are seldom met. Very few workers have access to occupational health services, and even where they do, regulation is frequently not enforced. In 1993, Bennett argued that occupational health is a discipline out of focus. He said this because regulatory authorities are often self-appointed. They might be academics, but they're often members of the public sector or consultants employed by the private sector. These actors are seldom impartial and often have vested interests in how regulation is conceptualized. He also argued that occupational health is flawed, particularly in relation to radiation, because the regulation for exposure is based on threshold level values, or TLVs. These TLVs determine the conditions under which it is believed that workers may be exposed day after day with no adverse effects, even though we often know that there's no threshold or lower limit below which exposure is safe. Occupational health is also often based on something called the ALARA principle. This stands for as low as is reasonably achievable, taking into account social, political, and economic factors. So MetLife, an insurance company in the United States, supported the introduction of threshold level values for asbestos, even though it recognized that there was no safe level of exposure. And it did this because threshold level values provided them with a good basis to defend against legal claims. And what Bennett argued is that science is being used here uncritically to entrench workplace pollution, rather than to promote strategies to prevent it. Turning now to an asbestos case study, and you've already heard a little bit about asbestos through the example of MetLife. Asbestos is a mineral which, as you can see in the picture, is found in rocks in the earth. There are 3 kinds of asbestos present in natural deposits: blue asbestos, or chrysotile, white asbestos, or chrysotile, and brown asbestos, or amosite. Blue and brown asbestos are the most dangerous and are not mined anymore. A debate exists as to the levels of dangers posed by white asbestos, and some countries, including Canada and Russia, still mine it. Asbestos was considered a magic mineral in the 1970s, and it symbolized all the possibilities of a modern era. It was most famous for its fireproofing and insulating qualities, which gave it a special status after the 2 world wars as a mineral of strategic importance. It is very durable and long-lasting. It doesn't corrode easily. Rodents and insects don't like it. So it's very attractive to manufacturers. Asbestos, although found in rocks, can be woven into a thread and developed into a fabric. I'd like to read you a quote from Jock McCullough's book on the asbestos blues. He says, "In appearance, asbestos fibers are as light as eiderdown, and yet as hard as any stone. To the touch, a piece of raw asbestos is like a rock, but with the fingers, individual fibers can be teased apart. When placed under the microscope, each fiber can be seen to consist of thousands of fine threads. Asbestos can be subdivided almost infinitely until molecular dimensions are achieved. A single strand weighing less than an ounce can be spun out for 300 feet, and a square yard of woven cloth will weigh less than 8 ounces. Asbestos is also not a conductor of electricity, and this, coupled with its fireproofing qualities, makes it, as Bartrip wrote, the perfect material for an industrializing and electrifying world of heat, combustion, and high-speed locomotion. Asbestos has been used in everything: in beer filters, in mattresses, in brake linings, in ships, in our houses, in cigarette filters, etc. But asbestos is also associated with a range of diseases: pleural plaques, pleural thickening, asbestosis, lung cancer, and mesothelioma. There is currently no treatment for any of these diseases. Pleural plaques are relatively benign, and mesothelioma is a malignant cancer. Microscopic exposure can result in mesothelioma, but massive exposure does not always lead to disease in individuals. The dangers of asbestos have been known since the early 1900s, and looking at the history of asbestos, one can see that very little was done until the 1980s, when some asbestos mines started to close. In the UK, blue and brown asbestos were banned in 1986, but white asbestos was only banned in 1999. And yet, by 1920, some medical journals were publishing articles on the dangers of asbestos and showing causal links between asbestos and cancer. By the 1950s in South Africa and 1960s in the UK, compensation was available for asbestos diseases. Looking back over this history, it is impossible not to realize a number of conclusions. Firstly, the focus on factories rather than the users of asbestos led to underestimated rates of disease. This is the imaginary jurisdiction of factories mentioned in part 1 of the lecture. While policies focused on factories, it overlooked the huge number of women who were contracting asbestos-related diseases from washing their husbands' overalls, and it overlooked those workers who were loading asbestos onto ships and trains for export. Secondly, this led to a failure to appreciate the worst-case scenarios, which in turn often led to delayed and inadequate policy responses. It also meant that the standards used in South Africa to define safe levels were not based on debilitating asbestos diseases, such as mesothelioma, but rather on benign pleural plaques. This meant that higher threshold level values could be set, and this in turn meant that more extensive exposure to asbestos fibers could be justified. So why was asbestos a hidden hazard? There are several reasons for this. One important one is something called the latency lacunae. This means that exposure to asbestos does not immediately result in ill health. Rather, one only becomes ill after some 20 to 30 years. This gap between exposure and becoming ill makes it very difficult to identify the cause of the disease, to know who to blame or how to take action against it. Often people were elderly and had moved away from their site of employment by the time they became ill. The latency period also makes it difficult for patients to recognize that their experience is not unique. It also means that it is very difficult to assemble collective evidence from factories or other work sites. This worked to the benefit of asbestos mining companies and manufacturers, but as G. and Greenberg remind us, it also raises an important point which relates to the precautionary principle, namely, that the absence of evidence of harm is not the same thing as evidence of the absence of harm. So why was there no evidence of harm? In part because of the latency period and other factors I've just mentioned, but also in part because of the powerful interests vested in asbestos mining and manufacture. Because asbestos was able to secure a special status as a mineral of strategic importance, and because these powerful interests were able to use this and market it as a product of modernization. So this raises the question of how important politics and economics are in relation to disease. Surely biomedical factors and expert knowledge by medical specialists trumps politics and economics. But using the example of pleural plaques, I'm now going to explore this question in more detail. Pleural plaques are the most benign of all asbestos diseases. It is generally described as scarring or thickening or a fibrosis of the pleural membrane, which lines the chest cavity and covers the lung. In South Africa, pleural plaques are recognized as a compensatable occupational disease. In the UK, pleural plaques are recognized as a disease but are not compensatable. And in India, pleural plaques are seldom recognized or acknowledged as an asbestos-related condition. The situation in the UK has not always been like this. Between 1985 and 2007, pleural plaques were recognized as an occupational disease in the UK, and sufferers could sue for compensation. But faced with a rising trend in asbestos litigation, insurance companies expressed concern over the escalating payments. They argued that this was financially ruinous and requested an investigation into asbestos diseases and their actionability. Much of this investigation took place in the High Court of England and Wales in 2005 through what has come to be known as the Greaves and Others test case. However, some of this investigation also took place through the IIAC, or the Industrial Injuries Advisory Council. This is the statutory body which advises the British government. It was asked to review pleural plaques in relation to the Industrial Industries Disablement Scheme. In order to be considered an occupational disease, there has to be epidemiological evidence that occupational exposure doubles the risk of contraction. The IIAC recognized that pleural plaques were underidentified. Often doctors don't even tell patients that they have it, as there is little that can be done about it, and that the increased incidence of pleural plaques is related to heavy exposure to asbestos. But the IIAC also argued that pleural plaques don't change the lung structure and don't curb lung expansion. When you talk to patients who have pleural plaques, many of them complain of general pain and difficulty in breathing. What the IIAC said is that there are alternative explanations for these symptoms. These might be undetected underlying lung fibrosis or pleural thickening stemming from age, smoking, or this pain and difficulty in breathing might be caused by anxiety. The IIAC therefore argued that pleural plaques are not a cause of cancer, although the presence of pleural plaques has been statistically linked with a greater future risk of these cancers. It argues that pleural plaques show that people have been exposed to asbestos and to something that causes cancer, but it argued pleural plaques are not evidence of cancer. In the IIAC's words, pleural plaques are a marker of exposure to the causal agent asbestos. The IIAC went on to say, any increase in risk in those with pleural plaques arises because they've been exposed to asbestos, not because they have pleural plaques. And therefore, compensating people for pleural plaques would be equivalent to compensating them for a future risk of disease or for anxiety. Or, as Gordon Brown put it, this would be giving compensation payouts before a disease develops. Perhaps I don't have to tell you that this is not how people who are diagnosed with pleural plaques understand or experience their disease. I have already mentioned the discomfort that they feel. In addition, many people who have worked with asbestos understand pleural plaques to be the first step on the road to mesothelioma. I have heard this countless times in interviews. They do not see pleural plaques as simply a sign that they have been exposed to asbestos. They see it as a sign that their bodies have been damaged by asbestos, and this makes them vulnerable to further damage. And in fact, this is how the South African government sees it, and how compensation in South Africa is determined and paid out. Underlying the insurance company's campaign to reassess the legal status of pleural plaques were a number of concerns. The first was obviously financial. They did not wish to continue to pay out for pleural plaques. But this is not how the issues were framed in the court case. Rather, insurance companies questioned whether pleural plaques really met the terms of an occupational disease, namely the doubling of risk of contraction. They also warned that asbestos victims' demands for compensation posed a threat to societal values. The language they used was of quote-unquote unwarranted compensation and quote-unquote irrational fears about mesothelioma. Insurance companies also spoke of an increasing culture of litigation, of scam bans and dubious claims, suggesting that the claimants were of dubious character and had personality defects. Victims of pleural plaques were, according to the insurance companies, seeking unjustified compensation. This was illogical and violated our fundamental societal values. And so, in the space of one court case and 4 years, pleural plaques went from being a recognized occupational health disease for which one could claim compensation to an irrational form of anxiety. The actual disease, the scarification of the pleural membrane, didn't change, nor did the scientific knowledge about the nature of the disease. What changed was political and economic. For me, this example underscores the need for a broader perspective, the perspective that environmental health offers. It is the emphasis on the epidemiological triad that recognizes not just the host and the agent, but also the environment in which both the disease and the way to understand and respond to the disease are constructed. So finally, to sum up part 2 of the lecture, and drawing on both this case and on the overview of environmental health provided in part 1, there are 3 things to bear in mind. First, occupational health has to be contextualized beyond the factory. It is not just about improving employees' welfare during the time that they are at work, and it is not just about the bodily functions and health of individual bodies. There is a need to recast occupational health as a political exercise and to understand it in terms of relations of power and economics. And there is a need to be vigilant about the explanations of ill health and, where necessary, to interrogate and challenge these framings. In concluding this part of the lecture series, I'd like to ask you another question. How are different occupational and environmental health issues being framed in your country? And comparing to other issues and other countries, can you begin to think about which are recognized and which remain hidden hazards?